Danny Cole had been stuck on the for 3 months. His cargo ship had crashed in the mountains during a storm and rescue was still weeks away. He worked as a laborer in the capital city, moving crates and cleaning streets alongside other stranded aliens. The tolerated outsiders as long as they worked and caused no trouble. Danny kept his head down and waited for his ticket home. The city was beautiful in a cold way. Towers of black stone rose toward purple skis and bridges made of something like glass-connected buildings high above the ground. They themselves were tall creatures covered in scales that shifted color in the light. They moved with grace and spoke in voices that sounded like wind through leaves. Danny found them fascinating but distant. They rarely spoke to outsiders unless necessary. On the day everything changed, Danny was walking through the market district when he heard drums. The sound was deep and steady, and it made the ground shake under his feet. People around him stopped what they were doing and moved toward the central plaza. Danny followed because he had learned that ignoring customs was a bad idea. The plaza opened into a massive arena carved from white stone. Thousands have filled the seats, and their scales caught the light like a sea of jewels. Danny found a spot near the back with the other laborers. A thin worker next to him explained what was happening in broken Galactic Common. This was the arena of oaths where disputes between noble houses were settled through combat. Today a warrior named had been accused of theft by a rival house. She claimed innocence and had chosen to fight for her freedom. If she won, she would be cleared of all charges. If she lost, she would face whatever punishment the accusing house demanded. Danny watched as a young female walked onto the arena floor. She was tall even by standards, and her scales were deep blue like the ocean at night. She carried a ceremonial spear with a blade that curved like a crescent moon. She moved with pride despite the chains of disgrace wrapped around her wrists. When the chains were removed, she took her position in the center of the arena. 3 warriors entered from the opposite side. They were large and covered in scars, and they carried weapons that gleamed in the sunlight. Danny felt his stomach drop. 3 against 1 seemed deeply unfair, but the around him showed no surprise. This was apparently normal. The fight began without warning. The 3 warriors rushed forward and moved like water flowing around stones. Her spear sang through the air, and she blocked and struck and spun with incredible skill. Danny had never seen anyone move like that. For a moment he thought she might actually win. But 3 against 1 is 3 against 1. The warriors worked together and slowly pushed her back. She took a cut on her arm and then another on her leg. Blood the color of copper spilled onto the white stone. She kept fighting, but her movements grew slower. The crowd watched in silence. One of the warriors caught her spear with his blade and twisted hard. The weapon shattered in her hands, and the sound echoed through the arena like a bone breaking. Stumbled backward and fell. She tried to rise, but her wounded leg gave out and she collapsed onto her side. The 3 warriors stopped and looked up at the judges seated in a high box. The oldest among them, with silver scales and eyes like black glass, nodded once. The warriors raised their weapons to deliver the final blow. Danny did not think. He did not plan. He did not consider the consequences or the laws or what any of this meant. He saw a woman on the ground, wounded and alone, about to die for a crime she said she did not commit. He saw the broken spear lying near the barrier just a few feet away, and something inside him moved before his brain could catch up. He climbed over the barrier and dropped into the arena. He picked up the broken spear and stood between and the 3 warriors. His hands were shaking and his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. The spear was heavier than he expected, and the broken end was jagged and sharp. He had no idea how to use it. He only knew he could not watch this happen and do nothing. The arena went completely silent. Everyone in the stand stared at him with expressions he could not read. The 3 warriors froze with their weapons raised. They looked confused as if they had never seen anything like this before. Behind him, Danny heard make a sound. It might have been a word, but her injuries made it impossible to understand. He did not turn around. He kept his eyes on the warriors and held the broken spear in front of him like a shield. The silver-scaled elder rose from her seat. She was ancient, and her scales had faded to the color of moonlight. She wore robes covered in symbols that Danny did not recognize. When she spoke, her voice carried across the entire arena without effort. She said something in the language. The words were old and formal, and they made the crowd gasp. The three warriors lowered their weapons immediately and stepped back. They looked at Danny with something that might have been fear. The elder descended from her box using stairs that seemed to grow from the stone itself. She crossed the arena floor and stopped in front of Danny. She was taller than him by at least a foot, and she looked down at him with eyes that seemed to see through his skin to whatever lay beneath. She spoke in Galactic Common, and her voice was like dry leaves rustling in wind. She said that he had done something very old and very serious. She said that by lifting the fallen warrior's weapon to defend her, he had invoked a law that most believed was only legend. She said the law was called the right of the unbroken bond, and it had not been invoked in over 1,000 years. Danny opened his mouth to explain that he did not know any law and he was just trying to help. But the elder raised one clawed hand and he fell silent. She told him that the law did not care about intention. The spear was lifted. The bond was made. His fate was now tied to the fallen warrior forever. Her debts were his debts. Her honor was his honor. Her life was his responsibility. Danny looked down at the broken spear in his hands. He looked at lying wounded on the ground behind him. He looked at the thousands of watching him with expressions he still could not read. He had only wanted to help. Now he had bound himself to something he did not understand in a world that was not his own, and from the look on the elder's face, there was no way to undo what he had done. The three warriors from the arena, without another word. They moved quickly as if Danny was something dangerous that might explode at any moment. The crowd remained silent and still as statues made of colored glass. Danny stood in the center of it all with a broken spear in his hands and no idea what came next. The silver-scaled elder, whose name was Matriarch, ordered healers to attend to. Two, in white robes, hurried onto the arena floor and began treating her wounds with instruments that hummed and glowed. Danny watched them work and felt his legs shaking beneath him. The rush of action was fading, and reality was settling in like cold water. Matriarch spoke to him again in her dry, rustling voice. She explained that the trial was suspended until the validity of the bond could be confirmed. Danny would be taken to the Temple of Ancient Laws, where scholars would examine the texts and determine if the right had truly been invoked. Until then, he was neither criminal nor citizen, but something in between. Guards in ceremonial armor escorted Danny out of the arena through a tunnel beneath the stands. The tunnel was old, and the walls were covered in carvings that showed warriors in battle. Danny wondered how many people had walked this path before him. He wondered how many of them had known what they were doing. He suspected most of them had understood far more than he did. The Temple of Ancient Laws sat on a hill overlooking the city. It was built from stone so white it seemed to glow in the fading sunlight. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of something like old paper and dried flowers. Shelves lined every wall and reached up toward ceilings so high they disappeared into shadow. Each shelf held thousands of scrolls and books and tablets made of materials Danny did not recognize. The scholars who worked here were old with scales that had faded to soft grays and whites. They moved slowly among the shelves and spoke in whispers as if the knowledge around them demanded respect. When Danny entered, they stopped their work and stared at him with open curiosity. A human in the Temple of Ancient Laws was apparently not a common sight. Matriarch led Danny to a chamber deep in the temple where a single scroll lay on a stone table. The scroll was yellowed with age, and the writing on it was faded almost to nothing. She told Danny that this was the original text of the rite of the unbroken bond written by the first lawgivers over 3,000 years ago. She read the text aloud and translated it for him. The law was simple in its language but vast in its meaning. When an outsider lifts a fallen warrior's weapon to defend them, they create a bond that cannot be broken. The outsider becomes responsible for the warrior in all things. Their victories become shared. Their defeats become shared. Their debts become shared. Danny asked what would happen if he simply refused. What if he put down the spear and walked away and pretended none of this had happened? Matriarch looked at him with something like pity. She explained that the bond was not something he could choose to accept or reject. It already existed. If he abandoned now, he would carry the shame of a broken bond for the rest of his life. No one would ever speak to him or help him or even look at him. He would be less than nothing in their eyes. She also explained that abandoning the bond would not free him from the debt. The debt would simply pass to him alone without to share it. And the debt of house was not something any single person could pay. Before Danny could ask what that meant, a commotion sounded at the chamber door. Entered supported by one of the healers. Her wounds had been treated, but she still moved with pain. Her blue scales were dull from exhaustion, and her eyes were dark with something Danny could not name. She looked at him and spoke in Galactic common that was better than most he had met. Her voice was rough from the fight but clear enough to understand. She told him that he had made a terrible mistake. She told him that he should have let her die in the arena. She told him that by saving her, he had doomed himself to a fate worse than death. Danny asked her to explain. He said he did not understand any of this, and he needed someone to tell him the truth about what he had gotten himself into. Sat down on a stone bench and the healer stepped back. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke her voice was heavy with old grief. She told Danny the story of House. Her family had once been one of the greatest warrior houses on the planet. They had served with honor for generations, and their name was spoken with respect across the entire empire. But 60 years ago, her grandfather had commanded a fleet in a war against a rival species. During a crucial battle, he had received orders to hold a defensive line no matter the cost. But holding the line meant abandoning thousands of civilian refugees to enemy forces. Her grandfather had made a choice. He had broken formation to save the civilians, and in doing so, he had allowed the enemy to breach the defensive line. The military victory was delayed by months, and many soldiers died because of his decision. The civilians survived, but the cost was considered too high. The warrior houses had placed a blood debt on House. The terms were designed to be impossible. A champion of House must defeat the champions of all 5 major houses in single combat, one after another without rest between fights. No one had ever accomplished such a feat. The debt had stood unpaid for 60 years, and it had slowly destroyed her family. Her parents had tried to pay the debt and died in the arena. Her uncles and aunts had tried and died. One by one, every member of House had fallen until only remained. She had known she could not win against 3 warriors today. She had expected to die. She had wanted to die so that the shame would finally end. Danny listened to all of this and felt the weight of the broken spear in his hands grow heavier with every word. He had not just saved a woman in the arena. He had inherited a curse that had killed an entire family. Matriarch spoke again. She had finished examining the original text and her expression had changed. She looked at Danny with something that might have been fear or might have been wonder. She told him that the right of the unbroken bond carried implications that even she had not fully understood until now. The bond did not just make Danny responsible for debt. It also granted him rights that no outsider had ever held before. He was now a full citizen of the empire with all the privileges that entailed. He could own property and speak in councils and demand justice under the law. And most importantly, he had the right to modify the terms of any debt he inherited. Not by much. The modification had to be small, and it had to follow the spirit of the original terms. But it was a right that existed and a right that might make a difference. Danny looked at who stared back at him with eyes that held no hope. He looked at Matriarch who watched him with ancient patience. He looked at the broken spear that had started all of this. He made a decision. He would not abandon to this fate. He did not know how yet, but he would find a way to pay this debt. He was human, and humans did not give up. It was one of the few things he was certain about. He asked Matriarch to tell him everything about the combat rules. He asked her to show him every text that mentioned the blood debt. He asked her to help him understand what he was facing. The old smiled for the first time since he had met her. It was a small smile, but it was real. She told him that she would help, and she told him that he was either the bravest creature she had ever met or the most foolish. She suspected he might be both. Danny spent the next 3 days in the Temple of Ancient Laws, reading every document that mentioned the blood debt of House. Matriarch assigned 2 young scholars to help him translate the texts and explain the parts he did not understand. The work was slow and frustrating, but Danny refused to stop until he had learned everything there was to learn. The debt was worse than he had imagined. The 5 major houses had designed it specifically to be impossible. A champion must fight 5 opponents in sequence without rest, and each opponent would be fresh and prepared. Even the greatest warrior in history had never accomplished such a feat. The houses had wanted House to suffer forever, and they had succeeded. Visited Danny in the temple each evening after the scholars had gone home. She sat across from him at the stone table and watched him work with an expression he was beginning to recognize as confused respect. She did not understand why he was doing this. No one had ever fought for House before except members of the family. The idea that an outsider would take on their shame was something she could not process. On the 3rd night, she asked him directly. She wanted to know why he had picked up her spear. She wanted to know what had made him climb into that arena and risk his life for a stranger. Danny thought about the question for a long time before answering. He told her about Earth and what it was like to grow up on a death world. He told her about the storms that could flatten cities and the predators that hunted in every environment and the diseases that killed millions before humans learned to fight them. He told her that humans survived by working together. They protected each other even when it made no logical sense because alone they were weak, but together they were strong. He told her that when he saw her fall in the arena, something inside him simply moved. He did not think about laws or consequences or what might happen next. He only knew that she was hurt and alone, and no one else was helping. On Earth, that was all the reason a person needed. Was quiet for a long time after he finished speaking. When she finally responded, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. She told him that we're not like humans. They valued individual strength above all else. A warrior who could not defend themselves was considered worthless. Asking for help was shameful, and accepting help from a stranger was almost unthinkable. But she also told him that she was beginning to understand why humans had spread so far across the galaxy despite being physically weaker than most species. There was something powerful in the way they refused to abandon each other. It was a kind of strength she had never considered before. On the 4th day, Danny made a discovery that changed everything. He was reading an ancient commentary on the blood debt when he found a passage that made his heart stop. The text explained that a bonded outsider had rights that native did not possess. One of those rights was the ability to modify the terms of an inherited debt. The modification had to be small, and it had to follow the spirit of the original terms. The champion still had to fight all 5 opponents. The fight still had to be sequential. But the bonded outsider could request changes to the timing and structure of the trial, as long as those changes did not violate the core purpose of the debt. Danny read the passage 3 times to make sure he understood it correctly. Then he called for Matriarch and showed her what he had found. The old examined the text with growing surprise. She confirmed that the passage was legitimate and that the right it described had never been used because no outsider had ever invoked the right of the unbroken bond for a house under blood debt. Danny asked her a simple question. The original term said the champion must fight all 5 opponents without rest. But what exactly did without rest mean? Did it mean the fights had to happen immediately one after another? Or did it simply mean the champion could not leave the arena between fights? Matriarch studied the original debt text for nearly an hour before giving her answer. The language was old, and the meaning was not entirely clear. But a reasonable interpretation suggested that without rest meant the champion could not leave the sacred ground of the arena until all fights were complete. It did not necessarily mean the fights had to happen in immediate succession. Danny smiled for the first time in days. He had found his modification. The next morning, Danny visited the ruins of House ancestral estate. Accompanied him, though she warned him there was nothing left worth seeing. The estate had been stripped of valuables decades ago, and the buildings had fallen into decay. But Danny wanted to understand what he was fighting for, and that meant understanding where it came from. The estate sat on a cliff overlooking the sea. The main house had collapsed, but the walls still stood like broken teeth against the sky. Gardens that had once been beautiful were now overgrown with wild plants, and the paths were cracked and uneven. Walked through the ruins with her head held high, but Danny could see the pain in her eyes. She showed him the memorial hall where statues of her ancestors stood in rows. Most of the statues had been damaged or destroyed by vandals over the years, but a few remained intact. She told him their names and their stories and the ways they had died trying to pay the impossible debt. Danny listened and remembered each name. These people deserved to be remembered. In a small chamber behind the memorial hall, Danny found something unexpected. A group of humans was waiting for him. There were 7 of them, and they were all workers from the labor district. Danny recognized a few faces from the docks and the warehouses where he had worked before everything changed. Their leader was a man named Park who had been stranded on the world even longer than Danny. Who had studied dozens of alien species, and he had heard about what Danny had done in the arena. He and the others had come to offer their help. Explained that he had been studying physiology for years. He knew things about their biology that most did not know about themselves. He told Danny that were built for short, explosive bursts of violence. Their muscles generated enormous power, but they tired quickly. A warrior at full strength was nearly unbeatable, but a warrior who had been fighting for more than a few minutes was significantly weaker. Humans were different. Human muscles were designed for endurance rather than explosive power. A human could not match in a short fight, but over time the human would outlast them. It was the same advantage that had allowed human ancestors to hunt prey by simply following it until it collapsed from exhaustion. Danny understood immediately what was suggesting. If he could stretch out the fights and force each champion to wait and prepare multiple times, their natural biology would work against them. They would grow weaker while Danny recovered between bouts. He asked if this was really possible. He asked if a human could actually survive 5 fights against warriors, even with the endurance advantage. Was honest with him. He said the odds were not good. He said Danny would probably die. But he also said the odds were better than 0, which was more than any had ever faced against the blood debt. Danny looked at who had listened to all of this in silence. He asked her what she thought. He asked her if she believed he had any chance at all. Met his eyes, and for the first time since he had known her she smiled. It was small and sad but real. She told him that she did not know if he could win, but she told him that she would help him try. She would teach him everything she knew about combat, and she would stand beside him until the end, whatever that end might be. Danny nodded and felt something settle inside him. He had a plan now. It was not a good plan, but it was better than nothing. He had allies who believed in him even when the odds were impossible, and he had a reason to fight that went beyond his own survival. He would pay the debt of House, or he would die trying. Either way, he would not abandon the woman who had no one else. Danny announced his intention to pay the blood debt on the steps of the Temple of Ancient Laws. Matriarch stood beside him as witness, and stood behind him with her head held high for the first time in years. The announcement spread through the city like fire through dry grass, and by nightfall every on the planet knew what the human had promised to do. The reaction was mixed. Some laughed at the idea of a soft alien challenging their greatest warriors. Others were curious to see what would happen. A few were angry that an outsider had dared to involve himself in sacred tradition. But no one could deny that Danny had the right to try. The right of the unbroken bond was clear, and its authority was absolute. Counselor was the angriest of all. He was the leader of house which had placed the original blood debt on the 60 years ago. His family had waited generations to see house destroyed completely, and now a human was threatening to take that victory away. He appeared before the Council of Houses and demanded that Danny be forbidden from fighting. His argument was simple. The blood debt was a sacred tradition meant to be paid by warriors. Allowing an alien to participate would dishonor the entire ritual and insult the memory of everyone who had died in the arena. The other council members listened to his words with serious expressions, and Danny began to worry that his plan would end before it even started. Matriarch spoke in Danny's defense. She explained that the right of the unbroken bond granted Danny full citizenship and all the rights that came with it. The ancient law made no distinction between native and bonded outsiders. If the council Danny's right to fight, they would be violating laws that were older than their houses and older than the blood debt itself. The council debated for 3 days. Danny spent those days training with in a courtyard behind the temple. She taught him the basic forms of combat and showed him how to hold a spear and how to move his feet and how to read an opponent's body for signs of attack. He learned slowly because his body was not built for fighting styles, but he learned. Park watched the training sessions and offered advice based on his knowledge of physiology. He pointed out weaknesses in the stance that Danny could exploit. He explained which joints were most vulnerable and which muscles tired fastest. He helped Danny understand that he did not need to match the in skill or strength. He only needed to survive long enough for their biology to betray them. On the 3rd day, the council reached its decision. Counselor had lost. The ancient laws were clear, and not even the 5 great houses could override them. Danny would be allowed to fight. But Counselor was not finished. If he could not prevent Danny from fighting, he would make sure the fight was as difficult as possible. He demanded that the 5 champions be chosen from the finest warriors of each house. He demanded that they be given the best weapons and armor available. He demanded that the fights be held in the traditional style with no modifications allowed. This was where Danny played his card. He stood before the council and invoked his right as a bonded outsider to modify the terms of the inherited debt. He requested that instead of fighting all 5 champions in immediate succession, the fights be scheduled 1 hour apart. During that hour, he would remain on the sacred ground of the arena as required by the original terms. But the hour would give him time to rest and recover between bouts. Counselor erupted in fury. He called Danny a coward and a cheat. He said this modification violated the spirit of the blood debt, which was meant to test a warrior's endurance and skill under continuous pressure. He demanded that the council reject the modification. Matriarch examined the original text of the blood debt and compared it to Danny's request. She took her time and read every word carefully while the council waited in tense silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm and certain. She ruled that the modification was legitimate. The original terms required the champion to remain on sacred ground without leaving. They did not specify that the fights had to occur immediately one after another. Danny's request followed the letter of the law. Counselor stormed out of the council chamber and refused to speak to anyone for the rest of the day. But his absence did not matter. The decision was made. Danny would fight the 5 champions with 1 hour between each bout. The night before the trial came to Danny in his small room near the temple. She brought a bundle wrapped in cloth and placed it on the table between them. When she unwrapped it, Danny saw a spear. It was her spear, the one that had shattered in the arena. A master smith had reforged it using the original blade and a new shaft made from wood that was dark and strong. Told Danny that this spear had been in her family for 12 generations. It had been carried by her grandmother and her mother and by herself. Now it belonged to Danny because the bond made them family whether they had chosen it or not. She asked him to carry it into the arena and to bring honor to the name one last time. Danny took the spear and felt its weight in his hands. It was lighter than he expected and balanced perfectly. He told that he would do his best. He told her that he could not promise victory, but he could promise that he would not give up. He would fight until his body could not move, and he would get back up every time he fell. Looked at him with eyes that glistened in the lamplight. She told him that she had never believed in the gods her people worshipped. She had seen too much suffering to believe in divine justice. But she told him that if the gods were real, they had sent Danny to her for a reason. She told him that whatever happened tomorrow, she was grateful that he had lifted her broken spear. Danny did not sleep that night. He sat by the window and watched the stars wheel overhead and thought about everything that had led him to this moment. He thought about his crashed ship and his months of waiting. He thought about the arena and the broken spear and the weight of a debt that had destroyed an entire family. He thought about and the pain she had carried for so long. He thought about Earth and the billions of humans who had no idea what was happening on this distant world. He wondered what they would think if they knew that one ordinary cargo pilot was about to fight for his life against alien warriors he had no chance of beating. He wondered if they would be proud of him, or if they would think he was insane. Maybe both. Humans were complicated that way. When morning came, Danny rose and dressed in the simple clothes had given him. He picked up the reforged spear and walked out of his room, and the other humans were waiting for him along with a matriarch. They walked together through the empty streets toward the Arena of Oaths. The arena was already full when they arrived. Every seat was taken, and thousands more stood in the aisles and on the walls. They had come from across the planet to witness something that had not happened in over 1,000 years. A human would fight for a house. An outsider would challenge the blood debt. Danny entered the arena through the same tunnel he had used weeks ago when everything began. He walked onto the white stone floor and looked up at the crowd and felt very small and very alone. 5 champions waited on the opposite side. They were the finest warriors of the 5 great houses, and they looked at Danny like he was already dead. He raised spear and took his position in the center of the arena. The drums began to beat. The trial had begun. The first champion was named Kel, and he was enormous even by standards. His scales were deep red like dried blood, and he carried twin blades that curved like fangs. He walked onto the arena floor with the confidence of someone who had never lost a fight and probably never would. Danny watched him approach and felt fear coil in his stomach like a living thing. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he planted his feet and raised his spear and waited. Running would not help. Fighting might not help either, but at least it was something. Kel attacked without warning. He moved faster than Danny could track, and suddenly the twin blades were everywhere at once. Danny stumbled backward and barely managed to block the first strike. The impact sent shockwaves up his arms, and he nearly dropped his spear. The second strike came immediately, and Danny twisted away by pure luck rather than skill. The crowd roared with approval. This was what they had come to see. The alien would fall quickly, and the entertainment would continue. But Danny did not fall. He retreated across the arena and kept his distance and refused to engage directly. Kel chased him with growing frustration and launched attack after attack. Danny blocked when he could and dodged when he could not and took cuts on his arms and legs that bled freely. But he stayed on his feet. Minutes passed. Kel's attacks remained powerful, but Danny noticed something changing. The warrior's movements were becoming slower. His breathing was becoming heavier. The explosive energy that had seemed unstoppable was beginning to fade. Had been right. Biology was built for short, violent encounters. Extended combat drained them faster than it drained humans. Danny just had to survive long enough for that drain to matter. When Kel's next attack came, Danny was ready. The warrior overextended, and Danny stepped inside his guard and drove the spear forward with everything he had. The blade caught Kel in the shoulder, and the champion staggered backward in shock. Danny pressed the advantage and struck again and again until Kel dropped his weapons and fell to his knees. The arena went silent. No one had expected this. The human had won the first fight. Danny stood over his fallen opponent and gasped for breath. His arms were shaking and his wounds were bleeding, and he wanted nothing more than to collapse. But he had an hour before the next fight. He would use every minute of it. The second champion came after the hour had passed. She was smaller than Kel but faster, and she fought with a staff that whirled like a tornado. Danny used the same strategy as before. He retreated and blocked and waited for exhaustion to weaken her. It took longer this time because she was smarter and she paced herself better. But eventually she slowed and Danny found his opening. The second champion fell. The third fight was harder. Danny was tired now and his wounds had not fully healed. The champion was fresh and eager, and he pressed Danny relentlessly across the arena. Danny took more cuts and bruises, and at one point he fell and had to drag himself back to his feet while the crowd watched in silence. But he got up. He always got up. By the time the third champion fell, the crowd had stopped jeering. Something had changed in the way they looked at Danny. It was not respect exactly, but it was no longer contempt. They were watching something they had never seen before, and they did not know what to make of it. The fourth fight nearly killed Danny. The champion was experienced and patient, and she refused to exhaust herself chasing him. They circled each other for long minutes and traded careful strikes. Danny's arms grew heavy and his vision blurred, and every movement sent pain shooting through his body. He thought about giving up. He thought about how easy it would be to simply stop and let the champion end this. No one would blame him. He had already done more than anyone expected. But then he looked up at the stands and saw watching him with tears streaming down her face. He saw and the other humans gripping the railing with white knuckles. He saw Matriarch standing perfectly still with an expression he finally recognized. It was hope. The old was hoping he would win. Danny turned back to his opponent and raised his spear one more time. His body screamed in protest, but his heart refused to quit. He attacked with clumsy, desperate strikes that the champion easily blocked. She smiled and prepared to finish him. But she was tired too. She had been standing in ceremonial preparation for hours, and the strain was showing. When she lunged for the killing blow, her foot slipped on the blood-slicked stone. It was a tiny mistake that lasted less than a second. Danny made it count. The fourth champion fell, and Danny stood alone in the center of the arena. One more fight, just one more. The final champion walked onto the floor, and Danny knew immediately that she was different. Her name was Sira, and she was the oldest of the five. Her scales were silver with age, and her eyes held the calm wisdom of someone who had fought 100 battles and won them all. She looked at Danny without hatred or contempt. She looked at him with something like curiosity. She did not attack immediately. Instead, she circled Danny slowly and watched his movements. She had seen his strategy now. She would not make the same mistakes the others had made. The fight began, and it was unlike anything that had come before. Sira paced herself perfectly and never overextended. She landed careful strikes that Danny could not block and opened new wounds on top of old ones. Danny fought back with everything he had left, but it was not enough. He was too tired and too hurt, and she was too skilled. He fell. The arena held its breath. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The human would finally stay down, and the blood debt would remain unpaid. Danny lay on the stone floor and felt consciousness slipping away. His body was broken and empty, and he had nothing left to give. He had tried his best, and it had not been enough. Would lose her house and her honor, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But then he thought about his conversation with her in the temple. He thought about what it meant to be human. Humans survived by refusing to give up even when giving up made sense. They kept going when other species stopped because their stubborn hearts would not let them quit. Danny put his hands on the stone and pushed. His arms screamed and his vision went white with pain, but he pushed anyway. He got one knee under him and then the other. He grabbed his spear and used it to pull himself upright. He stood swaying on legs that could barely hold him and faced Sira one more time. The arena erupted, not in cheers but in something else. A sound Danny had never heard before. It was the sound of weeping. Sira stared at him with an expression of pure disbelief. She had knocked him down with a blow that should have ended the fight. No warrior should have been able to rise from that. But here, he was standing before her with blood running down his face and fire burning in his eyes. She attacked again and Danny blocked. She attacked again and he dodged. They traded blows across the arena while the crowd wept and shouted and pounded on the stone seats. Minutes passed that felt like hours. Both warriors were exhausted. Both were barely standing. Then Sira made a mistake. She assumed Danny would stay down after one more blow. She committed everything to a strike meant to end the fight forever. Danny saw it coming. He stepped into the attack instead of away from it. Sira's weapon passed over his shoulder and Danny drove his spear forward with the last strength in his body. The blade struck true. Sira fell slowly like a great tree toppling in a storm. She hit the ground and lay still, and the arena fell silent. Danny stood over her with his spear raised and blood dripping from a dozen wounds. He had won. The blood debt of house was paid. Danny collapsed a moment later and did not move again for 3 days. When he woke, he was in a soft bed in the Temple of Ancient Laws with Sitting beside him. She told him what had happened after he fell. She told him about the ceremonies and the proclamations and the formal restoration of house to its place among the great houses. She told him that Counselor had been forced to acknowledge the debt as paid and that his house had lost significant standing for opposing the ancient laws. She told him that he was famous now. Stories of the human who had paid the impossible debt were spreading across the empire. Other species were hearing about what he had done. The name Danny Cole was becoming known throughout the galaxy. Danny listened to all of this and felt nothing but exhaustion. He had not fought for fame or glory. He had fought because someone needed help and no one else was offering. 3 months later, Danny stood on a platform in the capital city as the first human ambassador to the Empire, stood beside him as his bonded partner and chief advisor. The right of the unbroken bond had become the foundation for a new era of human relations. Trade agreements were being negotiated. Cultural exchanges were being planned. 2 species that had barely known each other were becoming allies. A scholar approached Danny after the ceremony and asked the question that everyone wanted to know. Why had he picked up the spear that day in the arena? Why had he risked everything for a stranger? Danny thought about the question for a long moment. Then he gave an answer that would become famous across both species. He said that she was alone and she was hurt and no one was helping. He said that where he came from that was all the reason you ever needed. The scholar wrote down his words, and they spread across the galaxy like seeds carried by the wind. And on 1,000 worlds, beings of every shape and size heard the story of the human who had lifted a broken spear to defend a stranger. They heard about a species that refused to abandon each other no matter the cost. They heard about humanity,